This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 12th of July 2025. I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's show, I'm joined by Charles Hecker, who is an author and a Russia analyst. We'll have a look through the week's news and culture. And then,
by the 1930s, when you begin to get a much more slimline Art Deco kind of aesthetic, what you then get is people not so much trying to fit the radio into their homes, but actually designing their homes so that they could integrate a radio.
We'll explore an exhibition dedicated to the extraordinary history of radio. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, here's the news. A new preliminary report into India's worst air disaster on June the 12th, when an Air India Boeing 787 crashed, killing all 260 people aboard, finds that both engine fuel switches were turned off just after takeoff, triggering a total loss of power that caused the aircraft to fall within minutes. Investigators note the switches are protected by safety covers and cannot be flipped accidentally. The UN says nearly 800 people have been killed at Gaza aid distribution points in just 6 weeks. The sites, run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and guarded by US contractors, operate outside the UN-led system Israel accuses of being exploited by Hamas, a claim the group denies. A senior US general said NATO needs more long-range missiles to counter Russia, warning Moscow is rapidly boosting production. He said Russia's success with deep strike weapons in Ukraine has changed the way Western forces view future threats. And Giorgio Armani has reassured fans he'll return to the runway in September after missing Milan and Paris fashion weeks due to illness. The 91-year-old fashion icon has never before missed one of his own shows. Reports say he spent time in hospital but is now recovering at home. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Georgina Godwin, and with me in the studio, Charles Hecker, author extraordinaire of Zero Sum and Russia analyst. Charles, it's lovely to have you here.
You're too kind, Georgina. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, we've had a busy week, both of us. I think we've socially intersected a few times. I can't remember now.
we bumped into each other on sort of the book circuit, the media circuit, and the party circuit as part of the beginning of a long, hot summer here in London, Georgina. We're off to, I think, probably the best summer weather-wise that we've ever had in my history of living in London. It's a little bit too hot, but the searing blue skies and, you know, the atmosphere, you know how London blossoms as a city in the heat and just comes alive until it wilts. It's been a crazy summer so far.
It really has. And are you noticing everybody's got these little electric fans?
I have. And I'm very much of two minds about whether I should have one myself. I kind of think they look a little bit silly. I kind of think that they probably run out of, battery power after 15 minutes. I don't know what they cost, although it appears that everybody has the exact same John Lewis model. And a friend of mine said that there is a gigantic sort of crate on the floor somewhere upstairs in the electronics division of John Lewis, and people are just scooping them up by the armfuls. Do you have one?
I don't. What I have is a beautiful hand fan made out of Afro print, and it's sort of it kind of folds up quite small. So I have that with me a lot of the time. But honestly, by the time you've sort of flapped your wrist around, you've made yourself hotter by doing it.
You've got the strongest wrists in central London.
Luckily, I have a cooperative boyfriend.
You've got the analog version of keeping yourself cool. I think this is the handheld fan, which I just have to confess looks a little bit ridiculous, is very much the digital version. I haven't given in yet, but we'll see how long I last.
I mean, the point is that Britain is just not equipped to deal with the heat.
That's right, and this intense heat that really has sort of come in waves, starting in the early summer and lasting even up until today, has prompted a sort of series of introspective thought pieces on Britain and heat and air conditioning. And I'm thinking about an article I read in The Economist the other day that said Britain doesn't think that it's a hot country, but it should. And there is a little bit of the sort of slightly Puritan attitude towards air conditioning in the UK of air conditioning being a luxury. There's the way the housing stock in this country has been built, which is primarily to sort of retain heat. And brick homes heat up like kilns in the summer. I mean, you could literally sort of, make pottery inside most British homes. And, a little bit of the sort of, grin and bear it kind of attitude of like, look, it's hot, but sort of, deal with it. Whereas the rest of the world has air conditioning, and not just in the homes, but across public transportation, which is a very big, big issue.
Although, of course, not in France, and there's been lots of rows about that in France. That whether or not aircon should be there. Of course, it looks horrible on those beautiful buildings. And Marine Le Pen has said there should be a major plan to cool the country, but apparently the French would rather swelter.
That's right. Marine Le Pen's sort of version of a chicken in every pot, which was, I believe, Harry S. Truman's campaign slogan. I might have gotten that wrong. My American history is a bit spotty this morning. But her equivalent of that is that she would install air conditioning across France if elected. Of course, she has to get through, an appeal to her criminal prosecution before she even gets a chance to run for office. But she's promising air conditioning across La France, and we'll see who falls for it.
I mean, just last week, though, 84 French departments and thousands of schools were shut down because of the extreme heat. Top floor of Eiffel Tower was shut. The peak of Mont Blanc registered a temperature above zero for the first time ever for the month of June. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and obviously that the elephant in the room here is climate change.
That's right. And I should point out, I mean, having said that the rest of the world has air conditioning, that of course isn't the case. But the rest of sort of Western Europe and certainly the United States is sort of the world champion in air conditioning. And I think that's who we compare ourselves to when we think about advanced economies and the way we want to feel in the summer. It is inescapable that this is a result of man-made climate change. And we will have to adapt, whether it is trying to limit greenhouse gas emissions or cope with them via air conditioning, which of course is a mixed blessing because, to make one room cool, you have to make the other room hot. So, air conditioning belches out enormous, heat in exchange for creating cold spaces. And so we will have to manage this in one way or another going forward.
Talking about man-made, this preliminary report has come out on the Air India crash, which happened on the 12th of June. It's very interesting. It has a cockpit recording of the pilots, one saying, "Why did you switch that off?" referring to the fuel switch. The other one saying, "I didn't." And yet analysts are saying it's almost impossible to switch it off by accident.
That's right, Georgina. As we jump in earnest into the reviews of what's going on in the papers today, there is a story that is literally across the top of just about every paper and every news website this morning, and that is the results of a preliminary investigation into what happened with the Air India crash. As mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Georgina, Air India Flight 171, which is bound for London, of course, crashed, and Air India is obligated to produce a preliminary report as quickly as possible. This report shows that both of the switches that feed fuel into the engines were switched off seconds after takeoff. And you're right to point out that one pilot, although we don't know which, turned to the other pilot and said, "Why did you turn this off?" The response was, "I haven't." Both switches were then turned back into the on position. Fuel began to flow into the engines according to this preliminary investigation, but it wasn't in time enough for the aircraft to regain altitude and avoid crashing. This killed all but one of the 242 passengers on board, and of course, it killed 19 other individuals on the ground as it plowed into the cafeteria of a medical school just outside the airport's perimeter. This was India's deadliest air crash in almost 3 decades, just looking at some of the information that's being presented this morning in The Guardian. switching off the fuel feed into engines takes effort. It's not something that you can do by knocking the switch with your elbow. What's missing from this report, as noted in some of the papers and the coverage of the story, is that there is a cockpit video camera. And the cockpit video feed has not been included in the discussion of what went on in the cockpit in this preliminary investigation. All of the conclusions so far, and we have to emphasize that they are preliminary, come from the voice data recorder and from the data recorder and the voice recorder, known as the black boxes, that are typically recovered after an incident.
It's very interesting, and a huge tragedy for India, and bad news for Boeing.
That's right. Boeing is sort of been taking it on the chin lately after a string of incidents involving other aircrafts, including the 737. This is the first major incident involving the 787, and the engines are manufactured by General Electric. All of them are party to the ongoing investigation.
Let's go to the United States now, where, of course, there have been huge floods in Texas. And again, very, very tragic loss of life, lots of little girls at a summer camp and so on. Trump has been visiting Texas.
That's right. So what we're looking at is a story in the New York Times that talks about Trump wanting to undo his hostility or reverse his hostility towards FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This is the federal government's organization for supporting states that are struck by catastrophic natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires. Candidate Trump, and early days, genuinely in the first couple of days of his presidency, Trump said that he wanted to dismantle FEMA. And he was touring the site of a hurricane in North Carolina and said that FEMA was a colossal waste of money and doing a bad job. And then Kirstie Noem, who's the Homeland Security Secretary and has general oversight for FEMA, said that she was going to dismantle FEMA because it was an epic waste of money. The two of them are now very much singing a sort of different tune. Having toured the floods, the scene of the floods in Texas, which have casualties now of more than 100 individuals and more than a dozen bodies still missing and yet to be discovered. Trump is saying, well, FEMA's not that bad an idea. We think that we can probably improve it. We want a FEMA that works well and is a healthy organization and is there to support the states in their time of greatest need. This is a significant turnaround from his previous stance.
They're talking about streamlining it now rather than abolishing it. And of course, one of the ways to do that would be through AI, which is going to streamline so many things. But people are afraid, aren't they, of this brand new technology?
That's right. It's interesting, Georgina. I've been having some conversations with young graduates who are thinking of getting into the job market, and they're looking at jobs in political risk and geopolitics and analysis, which is where I got my start in my career more than a couple of decades ago when we didn't have artificial intelligence. And there's an interesting thing that I've learned about our ongoing relationship and our developing relationship with artificial intelligence, and that is it is eliminating a lot of entry-level jobs. And the kinds of jobs that you would be expected to have access to or opportunities that would be open as somebody who's just finished a BA or an MA at a British university and has, a fresh set of analytical skills, the places that you can put those to work are dwindling. Because they are being replaced by artificial intelligence.
Well, now today, radio is a familiar companion, but it was once the disruptive new technology. As the first ever form of home-based mass entertainment, it absolutely changed lives. So histories of radio tend to focus on the broadcasters, but one exhibition in Oxford is dedicated to telling the stories of the people who experienced this massive cultural shift. So Monocle's Mariella Bevan spoke to B.T. Rubens, who's the curator of Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home, to find out more.
Now we're taking you over to St Hilary, Cornwall for the first broadcast of the Nativity play.
I'm an artist myself. Do you do anything in the nude? I have a bath every Friday.
When it first emerged, they were a bit baffled by it, and they were anxious whether it was for them or whether it was just for rich people. Some people even wondered where it was going to happen. There was an idea that it might happen a bit like going to the pictures, that you would go somewhere and sit and listen. So there were lots of misunderstandings about quite what it would be, but it was very heavily promoted, both by the BBC, which had just opened, and the radio manufacturers. And surprisingly quickly, in about 2 or 3 years, suddenly really the whole country was talking about radio. And even if you'd decided, as a few people did, that you didn't want to buy into radio, you couldn't avoid it. It was everywhere. There were songs about it and advertisements about it. It was just the thing that everybody was talking about.
Radio not only drastically changed home entertainment, but for some people it even changed how they designed their homes. Could you talk a little bit about how radio impacted home decor and design?
I think to begin with, it was much more a case of how are we going to fit in this rather kind of scientific gadget into our late Victorian or early Edwardian home. By the 1930s, when you begin to get a much more slimline Art Deco kind of aesthetic, what you then get is people not so much trying to fit the radio into their homes, but actually designing their homes so that they could integrate a radio. And there are actually cases you can find in newspapers of people saying, yes, I redesigned my home with this kind of very sleek furniture, for example, because I wanted to fit in my beautiful, sleek, modern designed radio. So that's an absolute transformation between 1922 and 1939.
Radio Luxembourg began broadcasting in 1933. What does the popularity of stations like Radio Luxembourg tell us about the cross-border flow of culture in the 1930s? And how did international broadcasting shape listeners' sense of identity?
The main thing that the commercial networks broadcast was music, popular music, lighter music, what was called variety, which was a mixture of kind of music and entertainment, comedy and so on. And it broadcast those because it's what people wanted to listen to. Listeners stopped listening and moved over to Luxembourg, in particular in Normandy, in their millions. And the BBC suddenly realized that that was a serious threat. So it's absolutely true that this form of quite celebrity-led, light entertainment had its attraction across Europe. But as war approached, it also became clear that radio could be a really dangerous form of technology. Hitler and Mussolini used radio and monopolized radio in a way that meant that their message alone could be carried to their nations, to disastrous effects, of course, as we know. And at that moment, I think the idea that you might turn to radio for entertainment, but also for serious and truthful news and current affairs becomes very, very powerful again. And certainly by 1939 and the outbreak of war, British listeners are listening in particular to the 9 o'clock news almost like a religious observance. People leave the streets to go in and listen to the news. And in any case, when war broke out, because the military suggested it needed all of the signals, actually Normandy and Luxembourg were closed down, so they didn't even continue to broadcast from the beginning of the war.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The Trump administration is targeting platforms like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe. You know, these are platforms that allow people in countries with limited press freedom to hear unbiased news. Given radio's historic role in bringing the news and information to people on a broad scale, how does this history help us understand the significance of platforms like Radio Free Europe and the impact of cutting their funding today?
It emphasizes again and again and again how important radio is, that it's a very cheap and easy medium, and that it will bring truthful stories into people's lives. And again, when I've shown, in particular, elderly people around the exhibition, I've heard stories of the importance, particularly during critical political times and wartime, of radio. So that's not just British people listening to the BBC and the stories it's trying to tell as truthfully as possible. I showed around an elderly French woman who said that in her childhood in occupied Paris, secretly her parents would go every evening into another room and listen to the BBC because it knew that it was going to get truthful news that way. And that image of this young, as she was then, this young child being aware that her parents were finding out really what was happening by listening to the radio, I think gives you an idea of just how important that is today and what the defunding of these networks tells us about the way that certain governments are trying to limit our access to what is really going on.
We are not going to stop broadcasting. Broadcasting has come to stay.
That was Monocle's Mariella Bevan speaking to the curator of the exhibition, Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home. At least that's how they would have said it, wouldn't they? It's open at the Western Library in Oxford until the 31st of August. You know, Charles, obviously this has huge bearing on my own life because it completely changed my life, starting exactly this kind of station she describes, but in Zimbabwe, which then led to me having to live here in exile and, in fact, being banned from the country. So, I mean, it's huge.
It's, the role of radio in all of our lives. I mean, for you, it became a career. It's interesting. There was a really big change when I when I relocated from the U.S. to the U.K. I noticed that there was a difference in the way that Americans and people in the UK consumed information. There's a television in every American kitchen. There's a radio in every British kitchen, and that may be changing with time here as well. But it was noticeable to me the role that radio played more in British news consumption compared to American news consumption.
Absolutely. Well, so what did they do before that? How did you get information out before any kind of electronic thing? And I'm thinking back to the Middle Ages. How would you mark a big event?
Perhaps you would weave a tapestry.
No way.
Just in case you had nothing else to do and you needed to get the word out. Perhaps you wanted to describe one country's effort to invade another sometime in the 11th century. You might describe it via a tapestry. Is that what you had in mind, Georgina?
I think so, because, Charles, here on my list it says next, Bayer tapestry.
So thank you for that, Georgina. So what we're looking at here is an interesting story in the Financial Times. It says museums should collaborate, not compete, in a hostile world. And this sort of reflects upon the sort of recent week of love between the United Kingdom and France. And, of course, a state visit by French President Emmanuel Macron and a reception in Buckingham Palace and a meeting with the King and the Queen and the Prime Minister and all kinds of sort of diplomatic and economic and cultural exchanges. And sort of the exhibit of the century next year, coming to the British Museum, promises to be, a long-stand, an installation of the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a 900-year-old piece of embroidery describing the Norman invasion in 1066. And it is known as the Bayeux Tapestry because its permanent home is in Bayeux in Normandy in France. It's coming to the British Museum, but what the Financial Times tells us is that the Victoria and Albert Museum, known as the V&A, actually thought that it was going to be the home of this exhibition, and found out sort of by reading the papers that the tapestry and the thousands upon thousands of visitors that it will attract and the gift shop purchases and the notoriety and the media coverage was going instead to the British Museum. And so this is a really interesting piece that focuses on the times that museums, not just in the UK but around the world, when do they collaborate? When do they compete? They collaborate. Museums are constantly sending precious treasures and works of art around the world on loan to each other. There is a limited pool of money available to museums. That is where museums compete. And that is also where, by the way, not just between the V&A and the British Museum, but between UK museums and US museums, the United States is miles and miles and miles ahead in terms of fundraising. And there's a piece here that shows that the J. Paul Getty Trust, which runs the Getty Museums in Los Angeles, has an endowment of $8.6 billion. This is approaching sort of university standard endowment. London's Tate launched an endowment drive last month, and it wants to raise £150 million by 2030. So you can see that there's quite a gap in fundraising. Of course, British museums receive much greater public support than American museums, and so there's lottery funds and government funds to depend on here that the U.S. doesn't have. But the blockbuster, really the event of the year next year, is going to be the arrival of this tapestry, and you can already anticipate the queues around the block in Bloomsbury around the British Museum, but very much at the expense of the V&A. I might just add, by the way, though, since the V&A might need a little bit of an on-air boost at the moment, I made a trip out to Stratford, to East London, and I went to the V&A storehouse that is in what was once the media center for the Olympic Games in 2012.
It's now called Here East. It's fabulous. I worked sometimes from a studio there.
Yes, that's right. Exactly right. In the exact same building there, just sort of along the way, is the V&A Storehouse, which is literally the museum's warehouse of the treasures that it holds, but are not currently on exhibition. And it is a breathtaking way of presenting things that are actually sort of, they're exhibits, but they're not exhibits. They're in storage, but you can look at them. And it's this sort of museum, but not a museum. It's a phenomenal experience, and I highly recommend it.
Just going back to the Bayeux Tapestry. So the mood music around it's really, really changed, because at one point the Bayeux Museum was saying this will never, ever go anywhere. It's way too fragile. We can't do it. Now, apparently they've done tests and it's fine. And suddenly it's going to be okay. Anything to do with the fact that the museum itself is shutting down for renovations?
Right. No, I'm sure that's strictly a coincidence, Georgina. Yeah, I mean, I think that when the Bayeux Museum is closed for renovations, you've got to do something with the contents, and why not just sort of ship them conveniently across the channel? And they're getting Sutton Hoo relics in return. That's absolutely right. So there is an exchange of cultural icons and relics, and again, just a product of this rapprochement between the UK and France, between Starmer and Macron, and maybe between sort of not EU and EU, playing out on the cultural playing field. And if you do go and have a look at it, look out particularly for, I think it's the 93 penises depicted in the tapestry. Before we go, let's have a look at this piece in the Times. I love this. This is about restaurants being rated according to how good looking their customers are. That's right, Georgina. This is an absolute sensation, and the Times is taking us to a piece, something that's happening in New York right now. And there is a website in New York City called Looks Mapping. And what this does is it rates restaurants, but not at all by the quality of their food. Instead, it lets you know which restaurants have sort of the hottest diners. Who's the best looking, who's the youngest, who's the best dressed, who's the most up for it, I suspect. And it's funny, the reporter for the Times went to the restaurant that was deemed to have the hottest clientele, and went to the restaurant that was deemed to have the least appealing clientele, I should say, and actually found both places to be slightly disappointing in each respect, and that there wasn't anybody particularly ugly in the bad restaurant, and there weren't too many people particularly hot in what was supposed to be, the sexy restaurant. But I was wondering, Georgina, I mean, do you, when you go out to eat in London, where do you think the best looking diners gather? I mean, the point is, if you're looking for if best looking means youngest, those are the kind of places I wouldn't go to, because those are the places that usually don't take bookings. People are queuing. I just don't do that. Right. They're also the noisiest places. Exactly. Yeah. So I probably wouldn't naturally be drawn to a place that has a much younger demographic. But in terms of, I don't know, places that one would, the Woolsey or wherever, the places one would normally go to, I don't think it's either particularly good or bad looking, is it? Well, I mean, first of all, you're right to point out that there's some demographic bias built into this website, and it's come in for a bit of stick. And you're right to say that it skews young, so it associates good looks with youth. Number one, and there have been accusations that it's also associating good looks with being white. And so, we have to be careful about things like this. I was sort of racking my brains and thinking sort of where would I go in London if I didn't really care what was on my plate, but wanted to sort of, digest what was around me rather than what was in front of me. Here in Marylebone, within a stone's throw of Midori House, you've got some pretty good restaurants that attract a fairly good clientele. And then I just thought how subjective, forgive me, this all is. And I was thinking, well, if you want sort of the smart, polished look, do you go to restaurants in the city? And, if you want the sort of slightly more boho look, do you go to restaurants in sort of, sort of North London, Islington, sort of Stoke Newington or Hackney, where I live, for the sort of more hipstery look. And I thought, I guess the good thing is that as with cuisine and clientele, you get a fairly broad mix of whatever you want, on the plate and for your eyes.
And I think, restaurants are going to become, the whole way we use restaurants is going to become different because so many of us are post-food now.
That's right. I still consider myself very much food. I was pre-food for a while. Now I am very much food. At some point, I'm going to have to transition to post-food because you can only stay food for so long. But
well, I think that's our cue to go and have some breakfast, Charles. So
exactly.
Thank you very much for coming on. That's Charles Hecker there, and that's all for Monocle on Saturday. Many thanks also to our producer Mariella Bevan and our studio engineer Lily Austin. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.